I'm pleased to welcome back to the podcast my guest today. He's an engineer by education and training. He came to the Region of Waterloo from private business in 1992 after having worked alongside municipalities and realizing that he wanted to be one of those guys involved in making significant decisions impacting the community. He jumped right into the thick of it, initially as the manager of engineering, planning, and water resource protection. He would go on to become the chief administrative officer in 2004 and stayed in that position until 2020. During that time, he worked on many matters relevant to the development of the community. Some high-profile projects included the region's resource water protection strategy and rural water quality program. Thank you for that. Creating the Waterloo Region Tourism Marketing Corporation and the Economic Development Corporation. No small tasks, considering you need to convince 7 municipalities to come on board. The Syrian Refugee Resettlement Program, the region's consumption and treatment facility, of which we hope to have a second soon in Cambridge, the originally planned location, and of course, the granddaddy of them all, the region's rapid transit and ion transit system. And these and more, while building a team of over 3,000 people and managing one of the fastest growing regions in Canada. So I think we can say that he got what he hoped for and more when he first came to work for the region. I want to welcome back to the Old Grey Mayors podcast, Mike Murray. Michael.
Well, yes, thanks, Rob. It's great to be back. I guess that's always a compliment when you get invited back to something.
That's exactly that. Two things. First of all, I wanted to say, you have a well-deserved rest, but then the person always says, "Whoa, I'm still busy." So I imagine you're just busy in a different way. But exactly that. I was going to say the last time we talked about the interplay between the elected politician and staff, the yin and the yang, it was a very informative conversation. And I want to encourage anyone who's listening to this to seek out that podcast because it was really an enjoyable conversation, very informative for me as well. So,
yeah. And I certainly enjoyed it. It was fun to reflect back and just reflect on a lot of the kind of issues and challenges that we dealt with over, several decades.
Yeah, well, and it's all about, the staff part of it. Actually, there's probably 3 parties to this. There's the staff, there's the politicians, and there's the community. Absolutely. And you're trying to, manage all these 3 things to get enough people on board so you can advance these projects, right? So, totally. The buy-in, they get the buy-in. But today we're going to talk about Grand River Transit and the ION, or is it ION? Sort of like the Facebook, I guess, is becoming an iconic symbol. But like the ION, we're going to have a phase 1 and a phase 2. So we're going to have 2 podcasts for sure, because there's just so much stuff to go over. As you know, Jerry Thompson, your predecessor on a prior podcast, talked about the work he did on the concept and working to obtain funding for the environmental assessment. But that was just funding, and there was still that's no guarantee really of anything happening, right? I mean, when you get the funding for environmental assessment, there's still that's the tip of the iceberg of work that has to be done.
Yeah, you know what? That's actually a really good way to put it. So I think what Jerry was referring to was in 2004, the federal government gave the region about $2 million in funding to work on the environmental assessment for our rapid transit project in Waterloo region. So, that was great because it was kind of the first affirmation and acknowledgement from a senior level of government that, this concept was on their radar. This concept was worth pursuing. So it was really encouraging, but tip of the iceberg is probably a good way to put it because, between 2004 and when we started up in 2019, there was a huge amount of work to be done.
Yeah, it made me think sort of this analogy I always say with my spouse. I mean, we both have toolboxes, but mine has a checkbook and hers has all the tools. So it's easy to write the check sometimes. But I guess the one thing is it shows that by the commitment of money that the upper levels of government, would this have been federal or provincial, the funding for the environmental assessment?
The funding for the environmental assessment was federal.
Okay.
And, we'd really have to sort of go back in time, to what different governments talk about as priorities at different points in time. And one of the things that, I think Jerry was quite good at, and that we learned a lot over, the ensuing decade was you got to seize the moment. And, looking for opportunities where our government, federal or provincial, is talking about building cities, investment in infrastructure, intensification. The other thing we learned is lead ups to elections are a great time to get funding announcements. And
we're seeing a lot of announcements these days. So yeah, you're right. I see what you mean.
So those are like truly. So what we learned is there's a couple of moments in time. One is budgets, like sort of federal provincial budgets, and having your project mentioned in a budget, or having funding identified in a budget like that. That's a huge step. But it's only a step. And until you get the minister's announcement, the premier, the prime minister's announcement, and actually until you get something signed on paper, it's not real.
But that goes to the important point, though. I always say to people that if you want to know what, and I'm sure you say the same thing, if you want to know what a community is all about, take a look at the budget, because that shows what they're committed to spending actual dollars on within the community. And if you need to make something happen, you want to make sure it's in that budget when you're lobbying or what have you, right?
Totally. Yep.
Okay. So before we get to Ion, I want to touch on, though, the early history of Grand River Transit, because, it wasn't always a regional responsibility. And I think you sort of came into the role of Commissioner of Transportation before you were CAO, and you had to deal with transit in the region, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And GRT got created, it was like the official date was January 1, 2000.
Right. So leading up to that, I'd really cast my mind back, but sort of 1998, 1999, there was a lot of talk. I mean, it was one of those periodic discussions about, frankly, about amalgamation and about, transfer of services. There'd been some studies done about, another regional government review, what's working, what's not, what could be improved upon. And there were a number of recommendations for, mostly actually for services to be transferred from the local municipalities to the region. And then regional council and local councils had to deal with all of those. So one that was on that list was transit, and a recommendation that transit be transferred from a local responsibility to a regional responsibility. So prior to that, there were two transit systems in Waterloo region: Cambridge Transit, which served Cambridge, and Kitchener Transit, which served Kitchener and Waterloo. Waterloo had a purchase of service agreement with the city of Kitchener. So they operated as separate municipal transit systems. And, this is shocking when we think back on it now, but, 1998, 1999, you could not take public transit between Cambridge and Kitchener.
So you couldn't cross that 401, basically.
You could, so even if you had a passport, you could not take public transit between the two municipalities because they had two separate transit systems serving. But
couldn't they have a purchase of services agreement or something between the two of them?
They totally could have done that. The point is they hadn't done that up to that point. So I think there were a number of things going on at the time. One was just the politics of it, and I'll be really blunt. I think there was some thought on the part of some of the local municipalities, I'm speculating now, that if we tweak the system a little bit, then maybe people won't pursue an amalgamation agenda. Let's just tweak the status quo, let's make some changes, let's show we're trying to improve. And that the big amalgamation thing will just go away because people go, oh yeah, you're working on improving things.
Well, there was a lot of talk back then about, because this is when the province had decided around this time, wasn't it, that Toronto would be amalgamated, Hamilton, or I forget the other areas, but there was some talk about possibly Kitchener-Waterloo or the region being amalgamated at that time as well.
Yeah, and then let's talk about, what happened and who did what to who. The
Yeah.
region ended up off of the list of amalgamation,
Yeah.
but there was still, some pressure to do something.
Right.
And
Right.
I think that doing something with transit was part of,
Yeah.
hey, let's do something so that amalgamation won't get pursued. But
Yeah,
that's just
because
me.
there was sort of like the plan A, plan B. Like if you were in the group A or group B, group A were the places to be amalgamated. Group B were the places to have a discussion about regionalizing some of the services because for efficiencies or what have you. But on transit, um, obviously there was an interest amongst the cities to give that to the region because I mean, the transit is a very costly commitment.
Yeah. So that would be like the gift that keeps on giving. But yeah, so transit's a very costly service to operate. Both Cambridge and Kitchener had been actually disinvesting in transit. They'd actually been, I think, scaling back on routes. Probably Cambridge a little more than Kitchener. Just, like frankly, just as a money saving thing. They had some serious budget challenges in the 90s. And like all municipalities, they were looking for ways, how can we reduce our costs a little bit? Transit's always an easy target. So, I think the cities, for the political reasons I talked about, but also, some financial and practical reasons.
Oh yeah, because
we're
they're
willing
trying
to.
they're trying to hold the line on property tax increases, right? Because there's always this, oh, you can't have it higher than the rate of inflation or whatever which is like, I've never found any place where that's written in the law somewhere that it's got to be at the rate of inflation. But that's the rule of thumb that people started to develop and think, oh, it's what it's got to be. But during those years too, weren't the Harris years notorious for the downloading that was going on with respect to services down to the municipality, which added more costs? And if you want to maintain your property tax rate at a low level, you're going to be cutting some things like libraries, server hours, which always is a tough one.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a whole lot going on at the time. But I think, so from the local municipalities' perspective, there's a whole lot going on that said, this may be a service that, it might be good to transfer to the region. From the region's perspective, there was a lot going on that's saying, creating a regional transit system totally fits with many of the other region's goals. We had in 2003 approved the region's growth management strategy, which had a real focus on intensification, encouraging growth inward and upward rather than, and discouraging sprawl. Well, if you're going to do that, you need really good ways for people to get around, and you can't just keep widening roads through built up urban areas. So from the region's perspective, having a regional transit system made sense. So I think
but the one thing, the Jerry Thompson always talked about that line down the center of the region, right? That would be the transit corridor. Was ION like thought about in 98, 99 when you were looking at this amalgamation, bringing on the GRT to the region?
So, I guess it would depend who you talk to, Rob. Listening to Jerry,
you're the main guy. You were there, so
So I think Jerry would say, rapid transit was totally on the radar. It wasn't really politically on the radar,
right.
But the concept of a central transportation corridor for sure was.
Okay.
That was it, and that was in the region's official plan, had been for quite some time. So,
and that could have been LRT or BRT, for example.
Exactly.
Bus rapid transit or light rail transit.
Right. And all of those discussions were yet to happen. So it was, I would say, a small factor, but there were many other factors that I think led to the local councils voting to and it had to have approval from the local councils voting to transfer this service to the region, and regional council voting to accept this as a regional service. And so that all happened in 1998 or 1999. I think it was 1999, with a January 1st, 2000 go live date.
Was this that triple majority?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like a Senate change or something. It's like the constitutional change of
So
Canada.
it needed a triple majority, which it got. And then that launched into a significant amount of work.
Well, that's what I'm going to get to in a sec, but I just
yeah.
want to quickly on the triple majority. I mean, once the cities all say, yeah, we're into it, it's almost a given, right, that their representatives at the regional council would have agreed with that decision. So it's sort of like a couple of legs of this majority aren't really hard to get.
Yes, that is quite right. Yeah.
Yeah. So now you're the commissioner of transportation, and this falls in your lap, right? This is you're the guy. And how did you feel about all this at the time?
So my background was in water and wastewater mostly. I didn't actually have a lot of background in transportation and for sure not a background in transit. But so I just dived right in. And it was a fascinating process. Like, transit is actually a fascinating business. It's operationally intense, right? You got dozens and dozens of bus routes, hundreds of buses, thousands of bus stops, right? And every bus needs to arrive at every bus stop on time every day, right? And again, it's easy to say. The work behind the scenes to make sure that the bus is maintained, the bus goes out the door on the right time, you have all the drivers trained, you have all the drivers scheduled, you got appropriate spare buses, you got appropriate spare drivers when people phone in sick. You can deal with all the unforeseen things like construction and weather. So it is operationally intensive.
That'd be an interesting. That'd be an interesting ad. More so than what?
Well, more so than some other services where you got a little bit of space, like planning functions, for example. Like if something slips a day or two, like it's somebody gets mad, but it's not the end of the world.
No, you're right.
But if the bus doesn't show up, somebody's not getting to work.
If it's like a few minutes late and it's a cold winter day and you don't have a shelter, that's massive. That's what I'm gonna say. It'd be a neat, interesting to add. You have this person it's like 6 a.m. in the winter or 5:30 a.m. in the winter. They're at the stop because they got to get to their job or something. And then you have this whole behind the scenes thing going on about all the different people that are involved to make it to that one spot at that one particular time to pick up that one person, right? But it's crucial. Transit is crucial for a whole lot of reasons in our growing community. During the election of 2018, when I was running for regional chair, I took the bus from Conestoga down to Ainslie Station, Conestoga and Waterloo, Conestoga Mall in Waterloo, down to Ainslie Station in Cambridge. And the diversity of people you meet, and I engaged in a lot of them in conversation and the different things they were doing, visiting family, going to school, going to work, volunteering, and the diversity of people in there, newcomers to our community. It was fascinating. It's a whole ecosystem, a dynamic there, and so crucial for those people to get around.
And what you'll find, I don't know if you found this in your discussions with them, Rob, but for a lot of those people, they have no other way of getting around.
No, that's right. That is their only way of getting around.
They are dependent on public transit to get them to all the places they need and want to go. And, so that was an eye opener for me and our team at the region as we worked on creating Grand River Transit in, 1999. The other thing, so, there's a whole bunch of technical nuts and bolts work that had to go on. But then the other thing from a leadership perspective is just organizational culture and creating kind of a cohesive, positive, constructive organizational culture and a workplace environment that, was sort of reflected the regional values. And that was a really interesting challenge, it was actually 3 different organizations: Cambridge Transit, Kitchener Transit, and Mobility Plus,
Mobility Plus,
people with disabilities. So 3 different organizations, and trying to mold them, shape them into yet another organization, Grand River Transit, but also make sure that Grand River Transit was fully integrated into the region's family of services, and that
Right.
the kind of service culture that Grand River Transit was going to provide was similar to the kinds of service culture that the region had in other areas, like affordable housing and waste collection and other things.
What? So you ended up. So was Mobility Plus a separate entity at the time? Who was
Yeah,
operating that?
I think it was, and I think it was operated by a not-for-profit organization, I think,
Okay.
at the time.
But interesting. So, but with Cambridge and Kitchener, you would have had, were they same unions or different unions?
Yeah, different unions.
Really?
So
Wow.
yeah, and so that was a fascinating dynamic. And there's, Rob, you're a lawyer, you know this. There's labor law that governs what happens in the event of an amalgamation or a transfer of business.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's successor rights. And so typically the bigger union assumes the smaller union.
Okay.
So Kitchener was the bigger union, so they became the successor union. So right out the gate, there were some people who were pissed off, because
Yeah.
the unions corporately and the union leadership in Cambridge, because now they were sort of disempowered a little bit,
Right.
and although we viewed it as creating a brand new organization, that was our whole paradigm. We're creating a brand new
Yep.
organization.
Yep.
I think how a lot of the folks in Cambridge pictured it or felt it was, we're getting taken over by Kitchener,
Right.
which
Right.
wasn't the case. But I think because of some of the things that happened, like with the unions, it felt like that, and so that was a
There's a
constant challenge.
long list of grievances that go way back to when what is it? The county jail was put in Kitchener in 18 whatever. So yeah, no, I know. Actually, Jerry Thompson and I in a prior podcast we're chatting about some of that because he's a Cambridge boy growing up, right? So, but anyway, it's very interesting as he's talked about that dynamic over time as well. But okay, who became the director?
Yes. So, yeah, I think we had a competition, and the director of Kitchener Transit became the first director of Grand River Transit. And we created the first assistant director position in the history of the region. And the director of Cambridge Transit became the first assistant director.
See,
And
look at we try to accommodate, don't we? Like
we
we're
did. And
yeah.
one of the principles of this transfer was that everybody would have a job, right? So
Yeah.
we're putting these two organizations together, creating a brand new organization, and the deal was everybody's got a job, right? So that was one of the challenges, is because you had two directors of transit, you had two managers of transit operations, two managers of transit fleet, right? And so
Yeah.
and it couldn't all be, oh well, the Kitchener guys get the big jobs.
Right.
That wasn't on. So that was part of the challenge, was creating a new organizational structure. First, create the structure that makes sense, and then populate it in a way that makes sense functionally, but also that respects some of the dynamics of taking creating a brand new organization from two or three organizations.
And you had to balance where the maintenance facilities were going to be located, that sort of thing. Was there that sort of north and south of the 401?
Yeah. So again, the deal was the region took over assumed all the people and assumed all the facilities. So assumed all the buses, all the storage and maintenance facilities, they all got transferred to the region of Waterloo. So right away we had, maintenance and storage facility in Kitchener. We had another maintenance and storage facility in Cambridge. And then the work over the next, 5 to 10 years was trying to say, okay, well, what makes most sense for a truly regional service? Where do we need to provide new facilities? Where do we need to expand? Where do we need to invest in new routes? So that was then the work over the next,
what were the service levels like between Kitchener and Cambridge at the time that you took it over?
Yeah, so Kitchener had higher service levels, and you can measure service in different ways. There's ways to measure it, like hours of service per capita, those kinds of things, number of people within walking distance of a bus stop. So Kitchener for sure had higher levels of service, and initially, because of that, the service was it's called area rated. So people in Cambridge paid different level of property tax for transit than people in Kitchener did.
So area rated, just so people are understanding this, sometimes a municipality can say a certain geographic area, depending on a certain service might be particular to that area, then you're able to determine how much that is, and the people in that area will pay a little more in their property taxes because of the service that they're receiving.
Exactly. Yeah. And so different service levels in Cambridge and Kitchener, different property tax levels in Cambridge and Kitchener for transit. So then over the next, I'm going to say 5 years, the region made a really concerted effort to improve transit service in Cambridge.
I just want to point out that transit was area rated in this particular. So there was precedent. I'm not going to go there, but I'm just going to say there was precedent for area rating.
Yeah.
Eventually, your investments brought the services to a much higher level.
And you know what? We got to a point where the service level was basically the same right across the urban area. And we called it the transit service area, Cambridge, Kitchener, and Waterloo. So within that urban transit service area, we got to a point where essentially the service levels were the same. Hours of service per capita, walk distance to bus stops, those kinds of things. And then at that point, we phased out the area rating of property taxes. And now everybody within that urban transit service area pays the same level of tax, and they basically get the same level of service.
I can tell you though, for my 4 years around the horseshoe, I've called it the shoehorn in the past, but the horseshoe, in my 4 years, the measure of level of service, whatever that service is, between the different cities and the townships is always a contentious issue. And it was, for example, with paramedics, right? EMS response times, right? Where the police were going to be located. I know that wasn't really a horseshoe issue, but the EMS one was always a big issue about response time to Cambridge, Kitchener, Waterloo, the townships. So but that's always there, right? You're always trying to balance that as best as you can in the dynamic of our two-tiered municipal system.
Yep. So I'll give you one other little story about the creation of GRT. So, the go live date was January 1st, 2000. So what else was January 1st, 2000? Cast your mind back. That was Y2K. Remember that? Y2K, right?
The world was going to break down.
The world was going to end. And anything that was controlled by embedded computer chips was going to fail, at midnight on that day, at the very time that Grand River Transit is starting to operate. And so I was commissioner.
What were you doing at 12:01 January 1?
You know what I was doing? I was driving around different regional facilities. I had an early version of mobile phone. It was one of those mobile phones in a little briefcase in my car. And I remember meeting up with some of our water people at one of the water stations because, the water system was going to fall apart.
Right.
I remember going to Strasbourg Road, the big transit bus storage and maintenance facility, because the gas pumps were going to fail, the overhead doors were going to stop operating, we wouldn't be able to get buses in and out, and as you recall, nothing happened. It was the biggest non-event in history. But there I was at the genesis of Grand River Transit, January 1st, 2001, at 12:01 in the morning, I was there.
There you go.
Driving around.
We had the right man for the job. There you go. We had the right guy for the job. But so when did GRT and ION sort of become like now we talk about the linkages, right? Like they're so important. I guess it was an evolutionary thing as ION started to become, and we're going to shift to ION in a moment, but as you're doing all of this, I guess your focus is just making this one cohesive thing. And was there a time when it started to say, hey, like these are the tentacles for this ION spine, right?
Yep. And so, that happened, I would say, over the next 2, 3, 4 years. Sort of 2003, we had the region's growth management strategy, this focus on intensification, recognition of the need for a vastly improved public transit system, including the Central Transit Corridor. And it was those documents, sort of 2003 growth management strategy, the ROP at the time, transportation master plan at the time, started to envision dramatically enhanced transit system with a spine, the central transit corridor as the spine, and express bus routes as cross corridors that would feed the spine of a transit system.
So I just want, you said the ROP, so that's the regional official plan, just for people that are listening, right? Yeah. So around that time, the regional official plan is starting to take a closer look at these sorts of issues. Now, express bus routes were established, the I-Express basically you're talking about, right?
Yeah, so then we established the I-Express, I think in 2004, 2005, maybe 2005. And again, I think it was through a federal grant that we got some funding for express bus service, right? This whole I-Express concept. And again, so that was acknowledgement by higher level of government that enhanced transit in the region of Waterloo was really important.
There's always these grants for these experiments in transit, which is good. Like, for example, in Wilmot, right? I mean, sure. There was a grant that provided money to allow GRT to experiment with a bus route out there. And eventually now Wilmot contributes, I'm sure the region probably contributes, but they're maintaining that route. You got the Woolwich route that goes out there. Hopefully North Dumfries is getting something.
I don't know, Rob. But no,
I didn't do my job very well, I guess.
Oh, you got a good recreation center.
Yeah, thank you.
But it highlights often grants, provincial and federal grants, fund pilot projects. They're reluctant to get into funding things on a permanent they don't like funding operating costs, right? Because that ties them to, a permanent string of funding. They don't like that, especially the federal government. They really don't like that. So often they'll fund one-off projects, which is helpful actually, because then you test something out and proof of concept. So you try it out, you find what works, what doesn't, you tweak it, and then you get to a level where either it's sustainable and it needs to continue and the region needs to take it on, or sometimes, it didn't quite work as planned. We need to pull the plug on it.
Well, on that day that I was riding the bus during the election, I met a couple. It was a lady and her son who were going from New Hamburg down to Ainsley to meet up with some family members. And that was really their only mode of transport. And they were going to spend a couple of days and then they were going to head back. But that was their only mode of transportation. So that's like as far afield as you can get from one end to the other. And it shows, proof of concept, right? Yep. So now we're like, we'll just jump ahead because to August 2004. All right. That's like, I don't know. I had that date and month down here. I'm not sure why I had that month of August, but 2004 is, we've got the money for the environmental assessment. How does it then start, so to speak? That's like, okay, the money's here. Great. What the hell do we do now?
Yeah, it's sort of like that. It's like chasing the car and, dog chasing the car and then you catch it. Right. Okay, well, now we got to do this. But the region knows what it's doing in terms of environmental assessments, studies on big projects. So typically these environmental assessments, although it says environmental assessment, you need to look at the environmental impacts of your undertaking. But more importantly, the way these processes are structured is it's a structured way to look at what problem are you trying to solve, and then what are all the alternative ways of solving that problem, and really requires you to work through that in a methodical way. So that environmental assessment turned into a very significant, I'm going to call it, study of alternatives. So the first part was alternative
methods of transportation, right?
Yes. So first of all, it's this was sort of predetermined. We want a central transit corridor, but that we had to sort of prove out first. Does this make sense? Investing in a transit corridor as opposed to status quo kind of process of building more roads, does that make sense?
Right.
So that's the fundamental question is,
Right.
do you
Right.
want to embark on this path or not? So that was kind of
Yes.
question one. That got answered pretty readily, which is we can't just keep building more roads.
Yeah.
At the rate we're expanding, and if it's going to support our intensification goals and growth management, we can't just keep building more roads.
Well, the countryside line, right? We're holding the line through all of this.
Right. So that was question one. That got answered pretty readily. So then, okay, we're going to build a central transit corridor. Then it got more interesting. So then it's okay, well, what technology are you going to use
Yes.
to create this central transit corridor? So I think we ended up evaluating maybe 8 different technologies, ranging from subways, light rail, bus rapid transit, personal people movers, elevated tramway systems. Like, we had it all. And
what's a personal people mover?
it's like pods that move along, and they have them at some amusement parks, I think,
Okay.
Disney somewhere. So again, these are ideas that somebody came up with somewhere, and we'd be doing public consultation, and somebody say, oh, you need to be studying this because it works somewhere else in the world.
Right.
So we did a very comprehensive evaluation of technology alternatives. Very relatively quickly shortlisted that down to 2: bus rapid transit and light rail transit. And both of those had been, tested out, proven, used in other communities in North America and around the world, mostly in North America.
Well, with bus, okay, so let me just ask, because we can, first of all, it was always funny because we always used to get the R mixed up. We'd always say light rapid transit, but it's light rail transit. But bus rapid transit, does that mean like dedicated lanes and that sort of thing? Or what is the concept?
Yeah, so the concept for bus rapid transit is buses operating in a dedicated right of way. There's a couple of good examples in Ontario. Ottawa had one of the first real bus rapid transit systems in Ontario, probably in Canada. If you'd ever been to Ottawa decades ago, there was dedicated bus lanes parallel to the expressway coming into downtown Ottawa. So that was an example.
I was in Ottawa in the summer of '83. It was a lot of fun, but OC Transpo all the time.
Yep. So that was one. More recently, and a little closer to home, York Region has invested heavily in bus rapid transit. So if you drive around, there's busways along Highway 7 through York Region, like through Markham and Vaughan and places like that. So you drive around York Region, you'll see pretty significant busways. So it's a dedicated lane.
Gotcha.
And the stations are enhanced stops. Like, it's not just a pole on the side of the road. They have canopies and heaters and all of that. So that's what bus rapid transit looks like. So it's not cheap because you still need land. You need to create the dedicated busway.
Right.
But it is less expensive than light rail. So we got into a very significant debate about BRT versus LRT. And I would say both had their fans and advocates and supporters. In the end, and we had a really good team of advisors who looked right across North America and compared the experiences BRT versus LRT. There were a couple of compelling reasons for regional staff to recommend LRT. One was, although it was more expensive, it had anticipated significantly greater benefits. And some of those benefits were anticipated more ridership. There's good data that says some people who won't take a bus would actually take a train. So you can debate that, but there's good data about that. So more ridership and significantly more development along the corridor and around the stations. And that really fit with our intensification goal. We always had 2 goals with this system. One is moving people, and the other is shaping the community.
Let's hold on a sec. I just want to step back. More ridership. So is that the view that people have, that they don't want to step on a bus, but they'll step on a train? Is that sort of a snob approach? Is that what's going on here?
you know what, give it whatever label you want, but there's data that shows there are people who take a train who won't take a bus.
Yeah.
So for whatever reason, some of them would say, oh, it's more comfortable, it's faster. All of that may be true, or it
Yeah.
may be just a perception thing that,
Okay.
a train provides a different level of comfort and service.
Right. But okay, so on the second point then was the development, the intensification, the building. You're able to actually measure that by looking at other jurisdictions that have used either or and see what the development was like in those situations, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always hard to get a true apples to apples comparison because you never get, community A
Sure.
did BRT here and LRT here, and look what happened in community A here and here. You don't get that. So you have to do the best you can to compare similar kinds of communities and what their experience was. But that was what we found, and that was what was behind our recommendation for LRT over BRT.
That's like when people ask me what's my case worth, and I have to tell them no two cases are alike, so you just have to give them a rough idea. But yeah, okay, so but the view was, and I guess, I mean, obviously now the proof is shown that I mean, the development that's going on in Waterloo region is well, as my old German father would say, is unphenomenal, but that's a combination of unbelievable and phenomenal in one word. So it's amazing.
Yeah, it's astounding. And, we can talk about it more maybe later. But so 2011 was a big milestone. That's when Regional Council finally approved going ahead with the project. Since 2011, Rob, there's been $3.8 billion of building permits issued in the Central Transit Corridor.
Yeah, so you know what? And I can tell you,
it is astounding, actually.
Yeah, and even outside, even outside the corridor, the number of towers, 16, 18, 20-story buildings that are coming into the community, it's caused a ripple effect. You could say that one broke the mold and has resulted in massive, large buildings, which, from an intensification perspective, we need overall in this community.
Right. And that's one of the things I feel best about is when, I think that the ION has really been a catalyst for the revitalization of Kitchener and Waterloo and Cambridge. And I think, stage 2, it'll be even more evident in Cambridge.
Oh, but, they're already, they're already getting proposals out there.
No, I know. But you compare the vibe in Uptown Waterloo, downtown Kitchener to other communities that haven't invested in light rail. It's totally different. The amount of growth, development, interesting things, employment growth that's happening in the core is really astounding. And
it is.
So that I think that's a credit to a whole bunch of things. The investment in ION, but also some really far-sighted planning policies, because what you really need to make this successful is planning policies, financial incentives, and transportation.
Yeah, and we sort of jumped ahead. Yeah, we sort of jumped ahead, and we'll get back to that. It's sort of like going yada yada yada, and I had breakfast. But anyway, so what I want to get to, so back to the environmental assessment. I mean, you're comparing the two concepts. You're down to BRT, LRT. The recommendation is LRT, but the environmental assessment is looking at some other issues as well. Correct? I mean, a variety of issues as well.
Yeah, a whole variety of issues. Like, it looks at financial impact, social impact, environmental impact. So we went through all of that, and where there were potentially environmental impacts or impacts on the community, they were identified. And then really what you get into is, okay, here are some impacts. How do you mitigate them? So, if it's noise issues, how do you mitigate noise issues? By changing the route, by barriers, by how do you reduce vibration impacts, through good design, those kinds of things. So the environmental assessment was a good mechanism for surfacing those issues, hearing from the community. We did thousands and thousands of pieces of public input with either issues, concerns, here's things that you need to think about as you build this thing. So significant public input, raised a lot of issues, and then the EA was a really good mechanism to identify them and address them.
I think one of the things that probably struck me most after construction was the overhead wiring that you never really thought about during the whole process, and the amount of overhead wiring that one saw.
Yes, yes. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of overhead wires. And the other thing that goes along with the overhead wires is there's all the supports for them, the poles, and then some of the poles have to have like bracing and
Right,
support.
right.
So there's a lot, and there's a few areas where it is a bit visually intrusive, like through, I'm going to call it Midtown, between like sort of in front of KCI, Grand River Hospital. There's a stretch where there's 5 sets of traffic signals in a row, and
my friend Alex is probably nodding his head in agreement right now.
yeah, it is visually intrusive. So there's some impacts for sure.
Yeah, but noise wasn't a big issue though, was it? For this electric
Noise,
train?
noise has not been a big issue, fortunately. There's a few places you got steel wheels on steel rails, and so any place where you've got curves, especially tight curves, there's potential for the wheels to squeal. Friction. So there's a careful design of the curve radius. There's careful design of track and wheel lubrication in those areas. And then also you need really good vehicle and track maintenance to make sure that they stay operating smoothly. So every now and again now in operation, there'll be complaints about noise, especially in those tight curve areas. And that's something it's just an ongoing challenge with rail systems.
Was the environmental assessment the time when you decide we're not going to go down King Street in downtown Kitchener, but we're going to split it with Charles and Duke? Is that part of that process?
Yes. So I talked about the first part of the process, which was picking the technology.
Yeah.
So you kind of go through this incrementally, right? What's the technology, BRT versus LRT? And then as you start to narrow that down, then it's okay, what specifically is the route? Block by block from north end to south end. And that took a huge amount of effort. Right?
I can imagine.
Like trying to thread a needle, especially since we're going through historic built up areas in Uptown Waterloo, downtown Kitchener, downtown Cambridge.
Yeah.
It's really challenging. Narrow rights of way. And it would be different if we were building a suburban LRT system out in green fields and trying to bring people into downtown. No, we're trying to seamlessly integrate this into the fabric of the community, make it enhance the feel of the streetscape. And so to do that, to say we're going to build this and it's going to enhance the streetscape, that's a real challenge. And that's where we were dealing with some narrow congested rights of way and some issues of, okay, if we're going to build this in a very narrow congested right of way, we actually might have to expropriate and demolish all the buildings along one side of this road. And then you think, well, is that enhancing the urban environment by demolishing 20 or 30 buildings along one side of a road? No, that's destroying a cohesive neighborhood. So that's what led to some of the, I would say, pretty creative solutions where in some places, especially really congested areas in uptowns and downtowns, we split the route and had it going in one direction on one street, another direction 1 or 2 blocks over, to allow us to thread the needle. That's what I call it, like threading a needle through these congested, built-up areas. And I think so far it's working fine.
Yeah, but at that time though, you had to take it all the way from North Waterloo to South Cambridge as part of this process, right?
Exactly. Through the EA, we dealt with the whole route from north end of Waterloo to downtown Cambridge. And then as we got through the EA and everything else, ultimately what Regional Council approved is LRT from north end of Waterloo to downtown Cambridge, along the route that we had identified, more or less, built in 2 phases. That was the ultimate decision.
And we'll get to that.
I'm jumping ahead to 2011, but that's where we ended up.
Yeah. So just, and before, and actually I was just thinking, since the EA was done, I mean, there's a current EA going on for Cambridge Route Phase 2 right now. I guess the work from the prior EA will be of assistance to the current EA.
Totally. What it means is, and it has been, because the current EA work is actually just about done, and it built on all of the prior work. So they weren't
Yeah.
starting from we weren't starting from scratch. They were starting from really, really good, well thought out. But some things had changed over the intervening period of time. We learned more about LRT, how it worked,
From
what
from
worked,
actual
what didn't.
operations. Right.
Yes.
Right.
And so based on the region heard loud and clear from some residents in some parts of Cambridge about finding ways to avoid or minimize impacts on their neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah, I know,
And
especially in the Preston
yeah,
area, for example.
yeah.
But
And I think that's
so,
led to some creative solutions, actually.
but as you're doing the EA, is the EA process all about showing not only what the technology will be, where it's going to go with respect and the impacts of all that, but also ridership is there. This is a viable concept for the community. Is that the sort of things that the EA is dealing with as well?
Yeah. So whether that's absolutely part of so some of that for sure was part of the EA. Kind of in parallel with the EA, we were also actively pursuing federal and provincial government funding.
Right.
And so
because you have to show them that it makes sense for our region, right?
Right. And we tried to do this work in parallel rather than saying, okay, we're going to finish the EA and then we're going to start on the funding proposals. We said, no, we're going to do these two things in parallel to try to keep the ball rolling. So typically,
but hold on, let me just ask you this though. So even though you're doing the EA, it doesn't mean the government's committed to the project. The federal and provincial government's committed to the project. They're saying, here's some money. Sure, go ahead and see what it would look like in your community. But we don't know if this is a viable, we'll say, business for the regional government to operate.
Absolutely. Totally correct. So at the same time, and in parallel with the EA, what we were working on, I'm going to call them business cases. Right. And so really it's sort of benefit cost analysis, ridership, capital costs, operating and maintenance cost projections. What's going to be the net benefit or net cost of this? And both federal and provincial governments needed to see that kind of analysis done as part of considering funding applications. And we did some really interesting stuff in terms of benefit cost analysis, because typically a benefit cost analysis tries to boil everything down to dollars and cents. It tries to take all the benefits and monetize them, assign a monetary value to them, which is really difficult. If you think about some of the things that the region was trying to accomplish: protecting agricultural land, protecting sensitive water areas, avoiding sprawl, creating vibrant urban spaces. Right. It's hard.
What dollar value? What dollar value to put on that?
What dollar value do you ascribe to an aquifer that we don't pave over? So
it's a MasterCard commercial, priceless.
So pure economists would say, oh, no, you can do that. Mm-hmm. We actually didn't even attempt to do that. So we adopted a framework, this getting, kind of jargony, but we adopted a framework that was called multiple account evaluation. And so we looked at things kind of separately. Okay, what are the environmental costs and benefits? What are the social costs and benefits? What are the financial costs and benefits? What are the environmental costs and benefits? And we looked at that for each technology, BRT, LRT. We looked at that for different route options. And that became the basis of our funding applications and proposals to federal and provincial governments. And, I'll say there was a little bit of skepticism on senior government parts, because they looked at Waterloo Region and said, you guys are at the small end of the range of communities in North America that have light rail transit systems, or that have higher order transit systems, light rail or bus rapid. And it was true. But what we said very consistently, and Chair Sealing said this very consistently, is we're not building this for today. We are building this for our kids and our grandkids. And we may not absolutely need it today. Will we need it in 10 years? Probably. Will we need it in 20 or 30 years? Absolutely. And if we wait until then, it will be impossible and expensive to build, because
you had local opposition from Cambridge on this too. I mean, they got their own report that said that the region wasn't a viable option for
Yep.
LRT
Yep.
at the
Yeah, I
time.
recall that. Yep. And honestly, this was a legitimate debate. This was truly a legitimate debate. And I think people who were really, really focused on the dollars and cents, their argument was, we can't afford this.
Right.
The supporter,
Yeah.
their compelling argument was, we can't afford not to do this.
Yeah. It
And I
was very
think it was
passionate on
that,
both sides.
and I think it was that ultimately carried the day.
Yeah. So when you finally determined this is the route, this is the technology, the original route was it Waterloo, Conestoga Mall, or down to Ainslie Station in Cambridge? Is that the original presentation to the upper tiers, the provincial and federal governments?
It evolved a little bit over time. Like the original was very small and part of Waterloo and part of Kitchener. That was sort of a 2003 concept. But by 2008, 9, 10, it had pretty much solidified as Conestoga Mall to Ainslie Street Terminal in Cambridge. And then there were a couple little tweaks along the way, but it had pretty much firmed up that was the corridor.
What was the estimated cost of that at that time when you were making your pitches for money at that time? The cost for that?
Yeah, so that evolved a little bit too. Like I said, the very early one was short, included a convention center at King and Victoria in downtown Kitchener and some other stuff. And I don't even know what the cost estimate of that was. But by the time we were really serious, the cost estimate was around, I'm going to say 800 million, 820, something like that.
Right. To go all the way, the full Monty, north to south.
Sorry. No, I'm sorry, Rob. That's phase one was 800 and something.
Yeah.
So the whole thing would have been more than double that. So the whole thing was probably close to $2 billion.
Oh, even back then.
Yeah, well, it would have been more than double 800. So it would have been it would have been between 1.6 and 2 million.
Okay, so when we were seeking funding from the province and the feds, what were we seeking funding for?
So we were pretty much seeking funding for phase one. For a couple of
always going to be phase one.
And the primary reason was, as we worked through sort of those business cases, cost, benefit, ridership.
Yes.
What we realized is, first of all, trying to do it all at once was going to be very, very challenging, very, very expensive, probably wouldn't get the money. And the ridership south of Fairview Mall was dramatically lower.
So you had to build that up.
So we had to build up the ridership to get anywhere close to justifying LRT. And I know it's a bit of a chicken and egg discussion. Some people say, well, if you build it, they will come.
Yeah.
There is some of that, but you got to get to a certain threshold before it's justifiable. I think the region's getting way closer to that now. And stage two, I think, is way more viable now than it was 10 or 15 years ago.
But our pitch was for full funding from the province and the feds, or were we always going to be a part of that?
Our pitch was, here's this project. It has significant contribution to the federal and provincial economy. That was the pitch, is the economy of Waterloo region is important to the provincial and federal economies.
Yes.
And because of that, and it's important to the future economies of Canada and Ontario, growing tech sector and all of that. And because of that, our pitch was, federal and provincial governments, you should invest in your future.
How much?
Here's the cost. And it would to get as much as we possibly could. The province,
Mike, I was in sales. You have to ask for the close. You've got
to
ask.
So we were asking for the whole amount. But the other thing that was a little bit frustrating was the province in that period of time had a couple of different programs. At one point, the province had a list of 30 or so transit projects that they said are going to be fully funded by a combination of federal and provincial funding. That was at one point, and our project was on that list. We go, oh, that's great.
Oh, yeah.
And then that evolved into the province would pay 2/3 of the cost of these projects. Municipality would need to pick, or somebody else would have to pick up the rest.
Right.
That never materialized. And so then ultimately, the province came up with $300 million, and that was in 2010. And then shortly after that, the federal government announced 1/3 of the project cost, which was about $265 million.
Yeah. So we have 565 million committed on about a $860 million project.
Exactly. Yeah.
So now the regions, and this is just before the 2010 election.
So I'm going to go back. Yeah. So that was, so those announcements were in 2010. So I think the provincial one came first. It was maybe summer, and then the federal announcement was in September. I remember.
Yeah, Brian Storts told us the game plan on those announcements in a prior podcast.
Yeah.
So.
And you go back to what I was saying about lead up to federal and provincial elections are always good times to get funding commitments. So if you go back and look historically, there was a provincial election in 2011 and a federal election in 2011. Yeah. And in 2010, just before the municipal election in 2010, we got those federal and provincial funding announcements.
That's what we can say. We can say, how do we know an election's coming? Because there's another Highway 7 announcement.
Exactly. Yeah. Or Highway 413 in our current.
Yeah, well, that's the new one. But for us, it's been how many years of Highway 7 announcements? So,
yeah, indeed. Yeah.
So many. So now, so we're entering. I remember this election because this is when I ran for mayor in 2010, and I was sort of half listening to that because in North Dumfries Township it wasn't really impacting us because it wasn't supposed to cost us anything. We won't talk about development charges, but I didn't. But my thought was, oh, this thing's in jeopardy because now the regions has to come up with 300 million, and it might be like a 9% property tax increase to fund this thing. So there was a I don't know if there was a concern or not. Maybe you weren't concerned at all. I'm not sure. How were you feeling at that time?
Oh, we were concerned. And, one of the challenges with these projects is they have to survive multiple election cycles, federal, provincial, and municipal election cycles.
Yeah.
So here we are in the fall of 2010. We have a project that regional council has endorsed. We now know what federal and provincial funding we're getting, but you're right, it leaves the region with a significant amount of money to come up with and questions about what's that going to cost. So that, the prime minister's announcement was September of 2010, and the election I think was October, November 2010.
Right.
And at that point, staff really had to kind of stay out of this. It's like, this is a political campaign and political discussion. We couldn't really weigh in on things between September and November. So it was a really intense election. There were citizens groups organized on both sides. Taxpayers for Sensible Transit was adamantly opposed to this. And then it's gone out of my head, another really active citizens group lobbying for it.
Well, there was TriTag around at the time. TriTag.
And they did, so people weighing in really vocally on both sides, and then the community spoke through the municipal election in 2010. And I think all of the candidates who supported the LRT project were reelected, and those who opposed it weren't. So that was very encouraging in terms of the project moving forward.
And so I remember, so the 2010 election happens. There's, people like Sean Strickland who have some concerns about the financing and are concerned about the 9%. Properly, a 9% increase is significant. And I remember being at the inauguration meeting where, we're all sworn in as regional councillors. And I never even thought about regional council when I was running for mayor because it wasn't even anything I was really attuned to. And I remember Ken's speech was so forceful and strong about the fact that we had $565 million committed from the province and the feds, and we've got to do something with it. So
Yeah.
This is where we're going to stop today's podcast.
Yeah.
And we're going to pick up what went on from there forward to the ribbon cutting in the next podcast.
Awesome. All right. Hopefully we can cover that in one go.
Well, we'll see, right? I mean, it's such an important story in our community, and it's great to have you to talk about it because, I mean, no one was more intensely involved in all aspects, even though I know you're apolitical, but you're aware and attuned to what's happening to provide us with some of the inside baseball information. So thanks for being with us today, Mike. Really appreciate having you here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Old Grey Mares podcast. If you have any ideas for stories or people you would like us to interview or reach out to, please feel free to contact us. And thank you again.